I'm going to walk you through everything that you need to know for the MCAT as far as it relates to immunity, B cells, T cells, the innate immune response, the adaptive immune response, the whole 9 yards. Really what's required of students as far as the immune system goes on the MCAT is a general understanding of the basics and the mechanisms, and then just a few quick facts memorized. So I'm going to walk you through that concept, and then I'm going to give you the facts. So stick around to the end. You'll see a little summary right there at the end. Or if you want this in written form with a little bit more detail and all the rest of the high yield topics, check out the first link in the description. We have a new book that Maggie and I have written. It took us all summer to do it, but I think it's a really well written book. Of course, I'm a little biased, but we wrote this book with the intent to take the MCAT and do nothing else with. So all the fat's trimmed off. I think it's well illustrated. So check that out if you're into some form or fashion of a written guide. But if not, then hey, we're here and we're going to be making these videos because this is a high yield series. So before we talk about the things that you need to know for the immune system, it's important that we talk about the things that you do not have to know for the immune system. So I'm going to list them out. These are the things that you do not need to waste your time memorizing, because there are so many details around this concept. I just took an entire test that was like a 6-week long block on just this subject, so you can go really deep. So let me list some of the things that you do not need to know, just in case you catch yourself, either on Google or in a textbook or maybe another MCAT prep book trying to learn. You do not need to know about BCR or TCR. So you don't have to know about T cell receptors, B cell receptors, or how they got their diversity. So that's going to include things like VDJ recombination, TDTs. You do not need to know about the specific effector proteins of the innate immune response. So that's going to be things like lysozymes, defensins, things like that. You don't have to worry about learning those because those are hyper-specific. The complement system is something that you probably learned in your undergraduate immunity course, but it's not something that's on the MCAT, so I'm not even going to touch on it in this video besides saying that it exists. So those are some things that you don't need to know. You don't have to worry about kind of how antibodies become so diverse, which is good because that's a huge topic. And you don't have to learn about the effector proteins of the innate immune system. You do have to learn about them for the adaptive immune system, but that's just because they're like immunoglobulins. You don't have to even know the differences between like IgG versus IgA. You do not have to know any of that stuff for the MCAT. So stop studying it. They're not going to ask you those questions. Is it good to know for when you get to med school? Sure. But are you going to forget it and then have to learn it again? Yeah, so just go ahead and learn it in med school. Now, so let's talk about what you do need to know for the immune system. I'm going to make the assumption that if you're here, you have a vague understanding that the immune system is a compilation of our body's different tissues and cells and the chemicals that it secretes to keep our body safe against invading microbes and cancer. And that immune system, which I'm just going to abbreviate as IS on my little fancy whiteboard, the immune system is first split into 2 separate divisions. So we're going to have the innate immune system, and then we're going to have the adaptive immune system. And we're going to talk a little bit about the hyperspecifics of the adaptive, because the other important thing is how the adaptive immune system splits into the cell-mediated and the humoral immune systems. And we have to know a couple small facts about those two, but we will only vaguely touch on what the innate immune system is and not go into the hyperspecifics of it, because that's when you get into things like complement, and we don't have to learn that yet. So before we get too far into the facts that you want to remember, let's talk about what these are. If you Google the difference between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system, you're going to get something to the tune of the innate immune system is non-specific in its approach to immunity, and the adaptive immune system is specific. And I'll abbreviate those as NS and SP. Now that's right, but the question is, what are we specific for? And the answer to that question is, when we're talking about specifics in this context, we're talking about antigen specifics. So the antigen is a protein that immunoglobulins or antibodies are going to recognize. So antibodies are proteins on our cells that can bind to other proteins and signal to our cell, hey, I know that guy, or I don't know this guy, we need to kill him, which is an odd dynamic. Anyways, so that's what's important. The adaptive immune system does recognize these antigens. You can remember that by the A. The adaptive recognizes these antigens, and that's what makes it specific. It's specific for the antigens of invading microbes. Well, if that's the case, like every invading microbe is going to have antigens. So what is the innate immune system? What does it consist of? Well, it consists of things that you don't even think about as being part of your immune system. So it consists of, it's characterized as like physical barriers, but it means things like your skin or your stomach acid or stuff like that. And those are usually the two that are tested on the MCAT just because they're so vastly different from the adaptive immune system. But there are individual cells, like white blood cells, that are associated with the innate immune system. And I'm going to list them out. I don't know that you're going to be tested on this on the MCAT, but I'll feel better if I at least tell you. So these are the white blood cells that you want to be thinking of in context with the innate immune system. These are the ones that the MCAT might test you on: macrophages, natural killer cells, granulocytes, dendritic cells. And if they try to give you hyperspecifics on the granulocytes, I just remembered the mnemonic grandpa Phil, because anything that ends in Phil for the most part is going to end up being a granulocyte. So you can think of things like the eosinophil or the basophil or the neutrophil. These are all going to be granulocytes, which are part of the innate immune system. Now, something that you want to keep in mind about the innate immune system is that it is inherited, meaning that it's germline encoded, so we inherit the innate immune system. We don't have to be exposed to pathogens. That's something that you automatically, thankfully, are born with skin, which hopefully is not a surprise to you. But if it is, make a flashcard of it. It's also real fast. So the innate immune system reacts in like minutes to hours, and your skin's always there, but things like these different granulocytes, macrophages, and things like the complement system, they're going to react within minutes to hours. So it's super quick, but it's kind of dumb. So it has no memory. So I'm going to give you a little mnemonic that's a little morbid, so brace yourself. Think about your grandpa Phil. Man, I hope you don't have a grandpa Phil. This is not going to go well. Think about your grandpa Phil, and he's losing his memory, so he's kind of going downhill. You're worried about him, but you know it's a fact of life. He's going to pass soon. So whenever he dies, you're going to get Grandpa Phil's inheritance fast. So it is what it is, but that's the mnemonic. The adaptive immune system, we already talked about how it's specific, but as far as the cells that make it up, you really are focused on B and T cells. It is not inherited. So this is something that you have to develop. You have to adapt to your surroundings by getting this immune system. And it's also real slow. So it's not like you're rapidly declining Grandpa Phil. This thing's pretty slow, but it has a great memory. So this system is what's responsible for your immune system to vaccines, previous infections, things of that nature. The immune system that you think of when you hear immune system is the adaptive immune system. And then one last thing that they might test you on with the adaptive immune system is that the memory response gets faster and stronger with each subsequent exposure. So those are kind of the broad strokes of the innate versus the adaptive immune system. The innate system is just kind of there. It's a collection of tissues and barriers and cells that are just there, essentially just dragging the lake to make sure that nobody is there or out of line. And because of that, it does not distinguish between human cells versus pathogenic cells. It just does its job. The adaptive immune system can differentiate between it's called self-antigens, which are antigens that we produce, but like a human cell versus a foreign invader like a bacterial cell or even a virally infected human cell. So the adaptive immune response can differentiate between those two. But it takes some time, right? And that's why it's slow. But when it can differentiate between those two, it has a great memory so that it doesn't get tricked again. And that leads to this faster and stronger response. So you remember earlier I talked about the adaptive immune system and how it can actually be broken down into two more divisions, the cell-mediated and the humoral immune system. Now I want to touch on that because the differences between the two are tested on fairly frequently, but first we need to understand the concept of how the adaptive immune system gets activated. So what happens is one of my favorite stories of human biology, and that is a bacterial cell. It can be any kind of microbe, but let's just say a bacterial cell comes into the body and it runs into an antigen-presenting cell. An antigen-presenting cell kind of inspects it, and it looks over and says, hey, you are not one of John's kidney cells. I'm going to eat you. And that's literally what it does. It will eat it. And it's called phagocytosis. So this cell will eat the other cell. The antigen-presenting cell eats the invading cell. And then, once it eats it, it chews it up. And then, once it chews it up, it takes little pieces of that bacteria's body and it shoves it on its head like a hat to tell the other immune cells that we need to prepare for people that are wearing this same hat. Now, that's not exactly how it works, but that's pretty hardcore. So let me explain this a little bit more sciencey and kind of draw it out so you understand it a little bit better. And I'm going to skip a lot of steps because I don't think they're tested on the MCAT. But essentially, let's say that a bacteria comes in and it is wearing this little birthday hat. That birthday hat's going to be an antigen. It's going to be a protein, and it's likely going to be a protein that's on the exterior of the bacteria, right? Because if we're worried about telling our friends that we need to find people that are wearing the hat, then it's best that the hat is on the outside of their body and not on the inside of the body so we can see it, right? Hopefully that made sense. So our antigen-presenting cells, which are exactly what they sound like, APCs, they consist of B cells, macrophages, and the most important one is a dendritic cell. It's like a dendrite, except it has nothing to do with dendrites. A dendritic cell, this is the main one. It's called a professional antigen-presenting cell. They're going to eat this guy, phagocytose him, and the way that they end up doing that is they take their membrane and they throw it around it, and then they end up pulling this guy in, and then it turns into one big cell with the bacteria in it. So once it ingests this microbe, what's going to end up doing is it's going to digest it. You don't have to know the mechanisms for that. And the mechanism actually differs, but depending on whether you're going for MHC1 or MHC2, which is literally just the protein that we're going to hold the party hat on. So it's the antigen-presenting cell's protein that it's going to hold the bacteria's antigens on to show off to its friends to say, hey, come attack this guy. So once you ingest that bacteria and then you digest that bacteria, you actually take proteins that are characteristically represented on the exterior surface of that bacteria, and you express them onto your MHC molecule. So that would look like our antigen-presenting cell with its MHC, and now it has a party hat. It takes that very party hat that was on the bacteria and it expresses it. So what that does is it allows lymphocytes to follow one of two paths. So it's either going to allow T cells to recognize that as a foreign particle and kill that cell, or it's going to allow B cells to recognize that and crank out antibodies against that specific antigen or the party hat. Now, for those of you that are in med school and for some reason watching this video, or you've had a really good undergraduate immunology professor, you know that it's a lot more nuanced than that, and technically that is not the way that it works, but that's how the MCAT is going to test it. So you can look at it as being one of two responses: the B cell response, which leads to a bunch of antibodies, or the cytotoxic T cell response, which pops the cell. Those two responses are either the cell-mediated or the humoral immune response. So this is kind of the basic story for how the immune system, or the adaptive immune system, gets activated. But whenever we're talking about cell-mediated versus humoral, it gets a little bit more specific, and that specificity has to deal with the MHC2 complex that it is actually using, and where the proteins which are like the party hats, where the party hats are coming from. So whether the party hats are coming from inside of the cell itself, the body cell, which I'm going to refer to as the self cell, or whether those proteins are coming from outside of the cell, like maybe some toxin that a bacteria is secreting. So the MHC complex, the major histocompatibility complex, is actually split into the MHC1 and the MHC2. And the MHC1, its main job is to take, it's called endogenously synthesized proteins, and what that means is they are proteins that the self cell is making. So in a healthy cell, it's just normal cell proteins, so normal things like maybe some albumin or something like that the cell is normally synthesizing. But in a virally infected cell or a cancerous cell, it's going to be faulty proteins, right? Because a virally infected cell is not going to make the same amount of proteins or the same kind of proteins as a healthy cell. And the same thing for a cancerous cell. So the MHC1, what it does is it kind of samples, it kind of checks its own self. It kind of reflects inside and says, am I still healthy? The MHC1 has good mental health. It says, am I good? And so it's checking its own proteins, and it's going to present them as a party hat to our T cells. Now, you remember earlier I talked about CD8 and CD4 T cells? Well, the MHC1 is actually going to present only to CD8 positive T cells. And we talked about how these CD8 positive T cells are cytotoxic T lymphocytes, which means they are toxic to cells. They can kill them. And that's exactly what will happen. If an MHC1 shows a cancerous protein, then this cytotoxic T cell is going to say, okay, well, you need to die. And it's going to tell this cell to apoptose. And that's one way of self-regulation. That's how our body actually fights cancer, or at least one of the mechanisms. The MHC2 complex actually puts exogenously synthesized proteins as its party hat. So this is exogenous proteins. So this means proteins actually came from outside of the cell, which means maybe we ate a cell. Right? This party hat was synthesized outside of the cell before we ate it. It wasn't made by our cell. It was made by something besides our healthy human cell. So that would be an exogenously synthesized protein. These exogenously synthesized proteins are great for the humoral immune system because what they do is they can lead to ramping up antibodies. So the MHC2 only bind to CD4 or the T helper cells, and that helps increase B cells to crank out antibodies, which end up killing the infection. So what does all that mean? What's a quick little summary for all of this in relation to the cell-mediated and the humoral immune system? What do we need to keep in mind? Now, a really easy way to remember this is called the rule of eights. And the rule of eights means that if I have MHC1, I have CD8. Well, 1 times 8 is equal to 8. If I have MHC2, then I have CD4. That's the one it's supposed to bind to, right? And 2 times 4 is 8. So it's the rule of 8 so that you won't mess it up. I actually think about this every time I get a question on it. So how does all of this relate to the cell versus the humoral immune system? Well, we've already kind of touched on some of that, but let's summarize the cell-mediated and the humoral immune systems, give you some quick little facts to memorize about each so that you can make sure to get all these right on test day. For the cell-mediated system, I want you to think that this is to fight intracellular molecules. Now, what are some examples of some intracellular pathogens? Well, what about viruses, right? So viruses get inside of our cells, they hijack our cell machinery, and they kind of make some noise. And what about cancer? Isn't a cancer just kind of like a faulty human cell? So cell-mediated immunity is our body's defense mechanism against virally infected cells and cancer. So if we're going to kill something that's inside of the cell, what MHC complex are we likely going to be using, right? So that should be MHC1. And then what cell actually does the killing? That would be a T cell. So that's why you'll hear some people call the cell-mediated system the T cell system. And it's pretty easy to think of it like that. Now, the humoral immune system fights off extracellular pathogens. So maybe that means we have to eat them and put their body parts on our head like a party hat. That's just what happens. So these are things like bacteria, fungi, etc. And what MHC complex are we dealing with here? That would be MHC2 for the most part. And then what cell is actually doing the killing? Well, the B cells are making the antibodies. Now, important little caveat here is that these B cells To make the antibodies, they actually turn into something called plasma cells. Once they're activated, they turn into plasma cells, which are essentially these big antibody factories. So it's a factory that just makes a bunch of antibodies whose receptors are going to recognize the party hat, right? That's all they do. They just recognize the party hat because that's the antigen that was presented. So they recognize the antigen that was presented. That's what these antibodies do. So that's one subset of B cells. And then it also makes a couple memory cells. So it makes a couple memory B cells. A much smaller percentage of the B cells become memory cells than plasma cells. But these memory B cells, what they do is, it's not very surprising, they help our immune system have memory of the invading pathogen, so that the next time somebody comes in wearing an orange party hat, we know to mess that punk up, right? Like, we know who that guy is and what he represents. And so that's what the memory B cells do, is they allow us to upregulate antibodies quicker in response to a foreign antigen that we've seen before. So let's do a quick summary. There are a couple things that we don't need to know when it comes to studying for the MCAT with the immune system, and those are things like how the antibodies get so hyperspecific, the effector cells like the complement system, the differences in the different immunoglobulins. The immune system is split into two large divisions, the innate versus the adaptive, where the innate is very non-specific, it's inherited, and it's very fast with no memory, whereas the adaptive is very specific. It uses lymphocytes like B and T cells. It's very slow, but it has a great memory. There's also this subsequent reaction where it is faster and stronger the more times that it encounters a specific antigen. That adaptive immune response is initiated or activated by antigen-presenting cells. And these antigen-presenting cells, depending on whether we're focused on presenting an antigen with MHC1 or MHC2, if it's MHC1, then we're sampling endogenous proteins, and we're going to present them on our own cells. And actually, every cell in the body, every nucleated cell in the body is going to do that, is going to sample their own cells and present them on MHC1, not just antigen-presenting cells. That should not be tested on the MCAT, but if it is, there you go. This allows our body to fight viruses and cancers. MHC2, which is only expressed on things like antigen-presenting cells, samples exogenously synthesized proteins, or proteins that are synthesized outside of the antigen-presenting cell. And what it's going to do is eat the other pathogens through phagocytosis, chew them up, put them on MHC2, and then express them on their surface as a party hat for our CD4 positive T helper cells to recognize and turn those B cells into T helper cells, or plasma cells. The adaptive immunity is split into two separate responses, the cell-mediated immunity and the humoral immunity. The key factors for the cell-mediated immunity are that it is targeting intracellular pathogens like viruses and cancer. It is using the MHC1 protein, and it is classically known as being T-cell mediated, and all that means is that the cytotoxic T cells are the ones that are actually doing the killing. The humoral immune system is targeting extracellular pathogens like bacteria, using the MHC2 protein as the antigen presenter, and using B cells, which turn into plasma cells and memory B cells, to kill and remember the immune response. A couple mnemonics that I included in our book are be extra humorous for the humoral immune system. It is composed of B cells. It fights off extracellular pathogens, and that is associated with humoral immunity. And Big Mac Daddy for the antigen-presenting cells, and that is the three cells that are considered to be professional antigen-presenting cells: B cells, macrophages, and dendritic cells. Thanks for watching this video. I feel like we found an area that has not been filled as far as science content explained in a fashion that is only geared towards getting questions right on the MCAT. I know that some of the things I'm saying and teaching are either going to be incomplete or feel like they're not telling the whole story, but I'm purposefully teaching for this one test. I don't feel like that material is anywhere on the internet that I've seen. It's certainly not in textbooks because everybody's so nervous to make generalizations in textbooks, myself included. So we're going to continue this. We're going to walk through all the topics that we feel like are high yield and explain all these in a highly testable fashion. Hopefully we'll improve in our formatting as we go throughout this process, but please let us know what you think could improve or how we can make this more fun. Do you want us to teach a little bit more? Do you want me to ramble a little bit more? Would graphics help a little bit more? We'll have to be a little bit intentional with our time. We can't spend forever editing because we are both in med school right now. But I want these to be as helpful as possible because it's my goal that there should be at least a sufficient way to understand all the high yield topics in one playlist on YouTube, and that's what we're trying to build right now. So it's going to take us a while to get all these videos planned and filmed and edited. So if you want the entire guide, make sure to check out the first link in our description. This is the entire document that Maggie and myself have written, that it teaches and gives illustrations for all of the high yield topics associated with the MCAT. If you've been looking for a zero cost way to support us, that is just as appreciated. Just subscribe to this YouTube channel, hit the like button, share it with a friend, and make sure to check back next week for another video. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for the comments that you're about to leave for how we can improve and the things that we did well that you like, that you want us to continue. We appreciate you, and good luck studying.